Be consistent.
Welcome to the Key to Consistency. I am your host, Rakia Collins, and on today's episode, we are going to be exploring the relationship between neuroplasticity and consistency. If you've never heard of the term neuroplasticity, or you're like, what is this? I will warn you, today's episode will get a little technical in nature. I am going to try my best to water it down, give you guys real life examples, and really help you understand what neuroplasticity is and what it has to do with consistency, and really just why it is so very important. So neuroplasticity, really in simple terms, is essentially your brain's extraordinary ability to change and adapt throughout your life. If you think about your brain and you think about it as a flexible, ever-evolving masterpiece, it is capable of rewiring itself in response to your experiences and to your actions. And I want to emphasize the fact that it is the ability to change and adapt throughout life. This is not something that is contingent upon a specific age or age range. This is something that when we think about your brain and neuroplasticity, it is truly extraordinary. The brain is one of the parts of the body that as humans, we still have not fully tapped into. And it's 2023. We have brain surgeons and people who specialize and study the brain, and is still, when we think about our body and our anatomy, one of the places that holds the most secrets. Neuroplasticity, as mentioned earlier, is not confined to a specific age or a stage in life. It really is a lifelong phenomenon that really underscores how incredible our brains are. Right? So even if you are a child and your child is learning to tie their shoelaces, or let's say as an adult, you're deciding you're going to pick up that second language, right? Neuroplasticity is at play irrespective of the stage of life that you are in. It is helping us shape our brain's structure in response to these new experiences that we're having. So when we think about neuroplasticity and really the complexity of it, I really want to focus first on the brain, right? The brain itself is nothing short of astonishing. It consists of 86 billion neurons. And a neuron is essentially a specialized cell that is responsible for transmitting information. So imagine the work on these neurons, because we are constantly and consistently being bombarded with information. And these neurons, right, when they form these collections or groups of neurons, they make connections with one another, and those are called synapses. And that's what allows the neurons to communicate with one another. So you can imagine there are trillions of synapses in your brain, because your neurons have formed these connections in order to make sure that you're able to communicate from one neuron to the other neuron. And to think that these are things we don't even know about that's happening in our brain. When we have these new experiences and we're forcing ourselves to learn something new or to adapt to a situation, our brain is now making a new connection, right? And that's why sometimes when we try to do new things, you find that there is a level of resistance there. Your brain is trying to form that new connection. And it's not the same connection as speaking English. If English is your first language, it doesn't take a lot of effort for you to speak English. Versus if you're learning and speaking in a new language, it takes time because your brain is trying to form those synapses. And of course, they get stronger and stronger over time, which is where we get our habits and our tendencies from, right? So I want you to imagine this. I'm going to give you guys a scenario about how your neurons and your synapses work and really what this has to do with consistency, right? So a few podcasts ago, we were talking about why reading is important when you think about reading consistently and what that does for you. So we're going to take that example of reading and I'm going to break it down in this context of what really happens in our brain when we start reading and we start reading on a consistent basis. So if you were to imagine that you were in a cozy little coffee shop, right? And in this coffee shop, you were engrossed in a book. I mean, this book has your complete attention. People are ordering their coffee. It's buzzing. You can see the fireplace crackling off in the corner, but you're not focusing on who's leaving, who's coming, who's ordering coffee. You are focused on this book, right? So as you're sitting in your chair and you're reading, your brain begins to process the words on the page, allowing you to understand the story that you're reading. This is just a very simple example of neurons and synapses. Right? So whenever you're reading a book, of course, in this example, your eyes are going to read the text that's on the page. It's going to capture the information that you are reading and then send that to your visual cortex in your brain. Right? And then from here, those specialized neurons we talked about earlier are going to fire off in your brain in response to the shapes and the patterns and the letters and the words that you're reading. Right? This is going to happen in those individual neurons because now they're picking up and they're recognizing particular features. Right? So how does that process into language? Well, as you continue to read, we have another set of neurons that are located in the language processing areas of our brain, and they become active. Right? These neurons are going to recognize the letters and the words and connect with the neurons from what we were reading and begin to process meaning. And that's how we begin to create a mental image of the story that we're reading in our mind. If you've ever wondered like how you can read an adventure book and then the words on the page in your mind become more than just black and white text. They really become a story in your mind that's really alive and that's very vivid. Well, that comes from these neurons making the synapses connections. It's truly remarkable, right? And the brain itself doesn't just stop at recognizing individual words, right? When we think about when you were a child and you had to read, but outside of reading, there was comprehension, right? It's like, yes, you read the words in the sentence, and that's excellent, but did you comprehend the words that you were reading, right? And why is that so important? That's so important because when we think about context, especially as you begin to grow and evolve and become an adult and go into college and raise kids and have a spouse and all these other things that are amazing, reading is the foundation of understanding context. Because once you read a book and you understand context, when you're having an exchange with your partner, with your family members, with your colleagues, you can begin to not only listen to the words that they're saying, but understand the context in that particular situation, right? So I know you're probably thinking, okay, Rakia, what does all of this have to do with consistency? Well, I'm going to tell you. That's a great question. When we think about neuroplasticity and how malleable our brains are, it is important that we are consistently challenging ourselves by putting ourselves in situations to have what I like to call adventures in life, right? I just gave you guys a very detailed breakdown of reading a book, right? And as mentioned earlier, if you didn't listen to the podcast about reading, you certainly should. But reading a book and challenging yourself to say, I'm going to read a book. I'm going to read a chapter, 30 pages a day. I'm going to learn a language. I'm going to do whatever challenge looks like for you. whether it's like getting one of those like brain apps that you can download from like any app store and like challenge your brain to like make certain connections and like learn certain things, whether you do like crossword puzzles, whatever you decide to do to help you challenge your brain. Neuroplasticity is, I like to think of it as a gift from God. It's a gift that our brain continues to evolve over time, and we don't have to do anything other than present ourselves with a new challenge, right? So if you consistently challenge yourself in different areas of your life, you're consistently building a skill set that's going to be beneficial to your career, to your family, to the world at large. You will become a person of impact, right? You will become a person that is consistently known in your circle of influence as, okay, this person is up for a challenge, right? 6 months ago, they were learning a new language. On top of learning a new language, this past month, they decided to go skydiving, right? Like any experience and adventure that you have allows neuroplasticity to take place because you are forcing those neurons to create those synapses to begin to form those connections. Awesome, guys. So if we were to think about neuroplasticity in how it can really impact us in situations that are challenging, I want to dive into a specific case study that I found that I thought was just very remarkable, right? I know we've been talking about neuroplasticity in the first part of today's episode in the sense that, hey, at any age, at any stage in your life, you can do it. You can go for it. And I know that that may sound kind of cliche, but it is scientifically proven with neuroplasticity that it is your brain's way of saying, I can change, I can grow, I can adapt no matter what age. Throw that challenge at me and I will get it done, right? So when we think about a challenge as humans, of course, we are meant to be adaptable. We are able to adapt ourselves to our surroundings in order to make sure that we survive. So when we think about neuroplasticity in this regard, one of the interesting case studies I found was how neuroplasticity impacts people who have suffered from a stroke. Right? When we think about what is a stroke, right? First, without getting too technical, of course, your brain controls your motor areas. And so when you have a stroke, the part of your brain that's responsible for movement doesn't necessarily work as intended, right? And so because that neural pathway that controls movement in your brain is damaged, neuroplasticity comes into play when we think about some intensive rehabilitation, when we think about physical therapy, occupational therapy, consistent practice. That is how we rewire our brain, right? So when you think about a person who has had a stroke, they go generally to daily rehabilitation sessions where the therapist is going to guide them through exercises that are aimed to retrain the brain and retrain those muscles, right? The exercises that they're going to give are meant to challenge the brain in a way to find new pathways and create new pathways to help control that movement, right? So things for an individual who, has suffered a stroke, things like picking up an object or buttoning a shirt, right? Even walking, they require intense focus. And why is that? Again, we're trying to create new pathways. We're trying to create those connections with our neurons and have those neurons turn into those synapses where we have them firing and wiring off. And those activities that the average person may take for granted when someone suffers a stroke, they no longer have, right? And so when we think about the first time you do it, it's going to be tough, right? And studying neuroplasticity, when I came across how it's used in the context of a stroke, it was very remarkable to me because over weeks and over months, you begin to experience progress, right? And individuals who have suffered a stroke, initially lifting the right arm an inch is a major sign of improvement, right? But of course, that inch can turn into a foot, and then more, and then more. And then at some point, walking without assistance, as they normally did before the stroke, becomes possible again, right? And why is that? Because there is no way that our brains, especially if you continue at it, right? It's when we give up that things stop happening. But when you consistently go for it and go for it and go for it, as if your life depends on it, in this context of someone who suffered a stroke, your life getting back to what you deem as your personal standard of normal, your life depends on that. And being able to say, I am not going to give up on myself. I'm going to continue to try to pick up this object, or try to walk without a cane, or try to walk without assistance. It is possible. It is very, very possible. And so I also wanted to think about neuroplasticity outside of the medical world. Think about neuroplasticity at your job, right? When you are at your job and whether you got a promotion or a new job or an old job, and you're in your role, but you might have gotten a promotion. It is so interesting to me that the brain continues to adapt even at work. When we think about your job, once you get new responsibilities, your brain through neuroplasticity begins to work and begins to show you how to adapt in those new situations and in those new environments, right? When you are faced with a big presentation and you are not a person who has given a presentation before, right? Like, you begin to research and study things about presentation and how to be a better public speaker, and you begin to go after those things because now your brain, because of the requirement or the challenge in front of you, you have now pushed your brain to say, this is something that we need to conquer. And now you're studying things you didn't study before, causing your brain to, again, those neurons and those synapses are firing off consistently. And now it's becoming a way for you to take in information. So as you read the first article, it may sound foreign when people kind of walk you through the standard steps to give a good speech. These are 5 top tips, right? But that's the first article. Once you get into the 5th or the 6th article, you'll begin to pick up certain things that are common from article to article. And why is that? Because now your brain is beginning to recognize those patterns. And so hopefully these examples are allowing you to see that you just have to consistently put yourself in an environment to challenge yourself, to push yourself, to be the best person that you can be, and allow your brain to take care of the rest, right? But what's so difficult about this is that when we think about learning another language, for example, that's something that is my current, I'll say, neuroplasticity journey, right? Is trying to learn Spanish. And of course, like, I'm sure most of us have been exposed to either Spanish or to another second language constantly. When you think about being exposed to another language, it's not easy at first, right? You're having to study things. And I mean, honestly, as crazy as this may sound, with Spanish, I had to go back to learning the alphabet because the letters are pronounced differently. And what I didn't think about was that at first when I was learning Spanish, I was just so quick to try to learn vocabulary words. But as someone who grew up speaking English natively, I didn't learn vocabulary words in first grade, in kindergarten. I had to learn the alphabet. How do you A, B, C, D? And understanding that in Spanish, if I'm going to learn their language, I need to start from the same level. I don't need to jump into third grade material, learning vocabulary words and putting things in definitions, because that's not how I started in my own language. And that simple breakthrough allowed me, one, to sound better when I'm speaking Spanish, because now I'm not having to think so hard about how do I pronounce this word. I can sound it out the same way as children. We used to sound things out because you would understand that, okay, SH, shut. Like, you would learn based off of grouping words or letters together and being able to pronounce them, right? And so for me, I know that was a crazy example, but hopefully that was able to resonate with you guys to see that when you're learning something new, it's going to be uncomfortable at first, right? But it is in the repetition. If, again, we think back to the stroke example, and it's something that you can't just do it one time. and think that, okay, great. Like the neurons get it. The synapses are formed. That's it. It is in that repetition. It is in that consistency. And that's where neuroplasticity thrives, is in repetition. When you do something consistently over time, it becomes second nature. A lot of us wonder why we can come home and immediately turn on the TV and we don't even think about it. Or why do you get up and just brush your teeth? And you brush your teeth with the same hand every single morning. You never switch. If you brush it with your right hand, you rarely ever switch to your left, right? And I would encourage you to do that one day, right? Why? Because you'll find that what you used to do on autopilot, because you've literally built such a strong synapses, like to pick up the brush with your right hand, put the toothpaste on it and brush your teeth that way. I kid you not. The moment you try to switch hands and do it with your other hand, it will be an entirely different experience. It'll be awkward. It'll be challenging. Why? Because the neurons are like, this isn't how we normally do this. We have to focus on what we're doing. We have to really fire and wire and try to build new formations, because apparently we're no longer doing this with our right hand anymore or our left hand. We're able to switch. Right? And so it's important to know that if you think about your brain's neural pathways, the simplest analogy I can give is like when you start something new, when you try to learn a new skill, imagine it like a dirt road. It's slow, it's bumpy. You want to proceed down that road with caution. We don't want to do anything to damage our car as we're going down a dirt road. So we take extra precautions, right? But with dedicated patience and practice, if we think about these pathways over time, we're going to get some cement on those pathways. We're going to begin to turn that dirt road into a regular interstate highway. And we're going to be able to go 80 at some point. It's going to be like butter. It's going to be smooth. But it all starts with that first step. And we have to be comfortable with driving down a dirt road and understanding that it's okay. Like it is a-okay, right? When we think about positive habits, as you're thinking about neuroplasticity and what new skill you can acquire and how your brain is going to help you achieve it, because that's the thing about our brains that I personally loved as a part of my research for today's episode. Our brains are for us. Our brains are for our personal growth. Why? Because neuroplasticity is literally exercise for our brains, right? If you work out your body, you know what it's like to have muscle recovery, because in the gym, you're tearing those muscles down and then they have to recover. And when they recover, they get stronger, right? When you are learning a new language, at the moment, it's tough. You're taking down, you are literally trying to make those connections form. And when you step back and you don't learn the language for a moment, let's say you go study language for an hour and then you come back and you do something else. Your brain is not just going to stop. Your brain is still working on, okay, we learned a new word today. We learned a new word today. It's still firing and trying to make that connection. And the next time you go after it and you try to speak in that new language, it's going to be a little bit easier. I'm not going to say a whole lot easier, but it'll be a little bit easier. And again, it gets a little bit easier with time. One of the things that we can focus on in order to make this journey of neuroplasticity in our brains a lot easier for us is being positive. If you've gotten anything from today's episode up until this point, I hope you've understood, one, the definition of what neuroplasticity is, and two, the fact that you can kill this process if you are not positive. If your mindset is like, this is so hard. This is so challenging. Positivity is like sun for your brain. If I were to give you guys a very basic example, like it really fosters an environment for the neuroplasticity and for those new connections and those new habits to really thrive, right? If you think about your ability to grow and to achieve as something that you want to do, not something that you have to do. I want to learn a new language. I want to learn a new skill. I want to do things that make me a better human. It is the want to that will encourage your brain to continue to go after it, because now it's not associating this new skill with, this is so draining. I don't want to do this. This is so boring. It's associating it with, wow, like this is a challenge, but I'm excited for this new challenge. I'm excited to see what things this new part of my life is going to bring out of me, right? It really depends on how you look at the situation. And that's really going to determine how you deal with your life and how you deal with life's transitions. The last thing, of course, that I wanted to mention to you guys is neuroplasticity in a negative light. The same way that our brain can pick up on these wonderful new skills and traits that we're trying to learn, our brain has the same capacity and ability to pick up on things that are not so good. Things like stress, right? Of course, because our brain is so resilient, and I like to think that neuroplasticity is in our brain's repertoire, or it's in our brain's resilience toolkit, right? There are things that can negatively impact that. When we think about stress, it is a common response to life and to life's changes and to adversity, right? But chronic stress can lead to structural changes in our brain in those particular regions, like our hippocampus, which really is involved in things like memory and emotional regulation. When these things are damaged permanently, it's detrimental to the ability for the brain to naturally form neuroplasticity, right? Now, not all hippocampus damage is permanent. Of course not. There are things that we can do. Of course, the therapies that were mentioned earlier, when we think about things like strokes, there are strategies that can be employed, but I don't want to think about the medical sense in this particular example. I want to focus on those of us who are putting ourselves under chronic stress, whether it's because of our job, because of life circumstances, because we just don't know sometimes where to go or what to do, and we continue to put ourselves under chronic stress. This podcast episode is not about stress, so I'm not going to harp on this point for too long, but it is important to know that with taking on new skills, learning new strategies, you will have the ability with neuroplasticity to dig yourself out of that hole of chronic stress, right? If you do a quick Google search on neuroplasticity and stress and strategies to overcome them, you will find hundreds of articles. You will find videos that'll help you see how you can rewire your brain in those stressful moments again and again and again, to where it just becomes second nature. When we think about things that could ultimately play a negative role in our lives, I don't have to spend too much time talking to you guys about stress, because we all know what it is and how detrimental it is. I would just encourage you to, if you know stress is something that you struggle with, find a good article, find a good therapist, find a good YouTube video, and just adopt some strategies or try them initially, right? And see how you can incorporate them in your lives, right? Things like positive self-talk, mindful practices, having a supportive circle. All these things done on a consistent basis will help you get over anything you're trying to get over, or if you're just trying to learn a new skill, as mentioned earlier, it'll just help, right? It will certainly help. We have to look at our brain as another muscle, right? Another muscle that through skill and through dedicated time, effort, and energy, embracing that positive mindset, that we can challenge those self-limiting beliefs and allow our brain to do what it naturally does with those neurons and those synapses, and really allow us to grasp the skill that we want to, and ultimately hit the goal that we're trying to hit. Right? So when we think about neuroplasticity, one of the things that, of course, I like to end every episode with is with the Bible verse. And of course, neuroplasticity within and of itself is very technical and doesn't necessarily have a particular verse in the Bible, but I felt like this one that relates closely to mindfulness and seeking wisdom and just being present in the moment is going to be very pertinent for today's episode. So today's verse comes from James chapter 1, verse 22 through 25. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. but whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. So hopefully this verse emphasizes the main point of today's podcast, which is consistent action, consistent learning, consistently pouring yourself over, in that example, the word of God, or pouring yourself over your new skill that you're trying to pick up, and really allows you to take that in as something that you're going to find the time to do every single day. Right? Hopefully, when you listen to that scripture, it encourages you to not just listen to the word, but to actively practice and live out the teachings of the scriptures. And hopefully, as a part of today's podcast episode, you thought about a new skill. You thought about something that was worth maybe revisiting, something that you might have put down, that the habit of painting, the habit of cooking, whatever your habit or your skill is, pick it back up. That's what I would encourage you to do. Pick it back up. No matter how much initial resistance you face, it will subside with time. So remember, guys, consistency breeds mastery and transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. Bye, guys. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of The Key to Consistency. Wherever you are listening to this podcast, it would mean everything to me if you rate it, review it, reach out to me on Instagram. Would love your feedback, would love to hear anything you like, anything you don't like. Please feel free to share this episode with someone that you think could benefit from it. And until next time, bye guys.